Hello, my name is Emma Skye, and I'm Director of Yale World Fellows and co-host of the Good Society Forum. The Good Society Forum is a community of change makers around the world with a common quest to build the good society. My co-host is Nizam Uddin of the Prince's Trust and a 2019 Yale World Fellow. Niz.
Thank you so much, Emma. Hello, everybody, and you are very welcome. Thank you for joining us today and for being part of our community that is dedicated to building the good society. So the first thing I want to do is share with you our brilliant new social media channels, because we want you to follow us and be part of our extended community. We are on Twitter at Good Soc Forum. We are on LinkedIn, and we're on Facebook as well. We would love for you to be part of our communities on those platforms. And actually for us, the forum is as much of our community as it is us in terms of myself and Emma. So we would love to hear ideas about what you would like for us to talk about. So if you have ideas for Good Society Forum sessions or wish to be a panelist, please do email us info@goodsocietyforum.com. So in terms of our structure for today, we're going to be hearing from 4 speakers on this brilliant theme over the resurgence of traditional media during COVID. And then we're going to take your questions, which means we are very keen for you to participate throughout our webinar today. And for us to do that, we would like to find out where everybody is from. So we would love to do what we have done previously and get a sense of where attendees are calling in from. So if you are able to share, just let us know, and you know the drill now, some of you. Where are you from? Just drop in your city in terms of the chat function that you see right at the bottom of the panel. So I can see we have good representation from Belgium, we have Brussels, and I think people are feeling a little bit shy. Oh, there we go, we have New Delhi, we have London. Thank you so much for coming along today. Fantastic. We have Washington, DC, we have West Berkshire, Newbury, New Haven, incredible. Mexico.
That's Gabby in Mexico. Hello, Gabby.
Oh, there we go. Ali from Vienna via Erbil.
And Erbil.
Brilliant, fantastic. And we're so fortunate to have this incredible community that we've already been able to build who comprise the Good Society Forum. So thank you so much for joining us. So Emma, what are we going to be talking about today?
Well, the coronavirus crisis has brought renewed focus and hope to traditional media, newspaper, radio, and TV. And with millions staying at home because of the travel restrictions, demand in established outlets has surged. So more audiences are tuning in to traditional media outlets, according to recent surveys. But how long will this last? Has this health crisis ended the traditional media's struggle for survival? So today we're bringing together 4 media professionals to look beyond ratings and explain the opportunities and challenges for traditional media highlighted by this global pandemic.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Emma. And before we begin, I think it's important for us to note the world of journalism is one where viewpoints can be attributed to an entity and they're not in this regard. So everyone who is taking part is expressing views that is their own and do not represent the organizations that they work for. So our first guest is Emma Graham Harrison, who is a senior international affairs correspondent at The Guardian and Observer. Emma has reported around the world, from North Kosovo to Venezuela, from the battle for Mosul to the forgotten war in Burundi. She was named Foreign Correspondent of the Year in the National Press Awards in 2018 for her international reporting. She has also worked on the Cambridge Analytica Files investigation, disclosing the manipulation of personal data and secretive online targeting in the EU referendum in Great Britain and the 2016 presidential election in the United States. Her reporting on that project was recognized in the National Press Awards, the British Journalism Awards, and by the London Press Club. So we are very grateful to have Emma with us, who's now hopefully going to join, brilliant, and share with us her views on the theme of today's webinar. Over to you, Emma.
Hi, well, first of all, thank you so much for inviting me to be here. I'm honoured to be on such an incredibly distinguished panel, and also very honoured that people have tuned in from all around the world to listen. I know it's sort of strange times and everybody's trying to juggle a lot of things that would normally have been separate in their lives have all collided together at their home. So yeah, I mean, as Emma said, it's sort of an extraordinary time for journalism in a lot of ways. There's unprecedented demand for quality news. There's also, interestingly, been a real increase in trust in journalists in some areas. But it's also a time of unprecedented financial crisis. I mean, I assume anybody tuning into this seminar has an interest in the media and would have noticed that the industry sort of been struggling to deal with its models, its financial models for quite a long time now. That there's been a sort of, gathering financial crisis as the legacy sort of press paper industry dies. People buy less copies, and it's hard for organizations to work out how to make money online. And the coronavirus has really kind of highlighted a lot of those problems. But I thought I might start with the good news, which is the trust and the demand. Last week, there was a report from the Reuters Institute for Journalism, which looked at trust and readership in UK news outlets specifically, but I suspect it would be relevant elsewhere. And I thought it crystallised sort of some interesting aspects of how the coronavirus has shifted the news environment. Traditionally, trust in journalists is quite low, as most of you know. Although we try our hardest, we're not the most popular profession. And according to this survey, only 38% of the audience think that they can trust news all the time. But when it comes to coronavirus, 57%, so well over half, rate news organisations as trustworthy. And that, as a journalist, is really encouraging. Obviously, it would be nice if the overall level was higher, but that's the public saying that we think in, one of the greatest crises of our lifetimes, you are doing a good job bringing us the news, at least in Britain. We outrank politicians, we outrank social media. So that's that sort of increase in trust, which has come with a huge demand, as Emma said, that people are consuming news on a scale that is very rare. I mean, the type of interest you see on an election day, when Trump became president after the Brexit referendum, but a sustained level like that for days and days at a time. In my own paper, The Guardian was seeing over 20 million unique readers a day, which, for a paper which at its peak, when it was a print publication, had a weekday circulation of 500,000, a weekend circulation of just over 1 million. That's pretty extraordinary. And those are, people who are tuning in from all around the world as well, not just from the UK. And, that highlights sort of one of the interesting things, I think, for legacy media, that you are speaking to a more international audience and how that kind of changes the way you think about who you write for. On trust for The Guardian specifically, there was some very good news. We were by far the most trusted of all newspapers. Traditionally, newspapers are much less trusted than broadcasters. Nearly twice as many people were saying that we were doing a good job as were saying the same for our closest rivals in the British newspaper market. And certainly, my feeling, I'm just a reporter, so I'm not in on the editorial meetings, but is that The Guardian always places a very, very high premium on accuracy. You see particularly the British newspaper market can be quite dog eat dog. There's people who always, The Guardian wants to be first, but not at the cost of being accurate. And I think that reputation for accuracy has really been something that has been recognised by readers and has sort of brought people to the paper and has built up that incredible trust. Unfortunately, the bad news about all this, this increase in trust, this increase in readers, is that it's not translating into increased revenue. And again, some of you may already know the reason for this. It's pretty simple. Basically, advertising has absolutely dropped off a cliff. There's already been problems with advertising as a model for sustaining the media, but you've had a sort of double whammy in that a lot of the organizations that might have normally in normal times advertised are closed or furloughed or don't have any reason to advertise their services if you're a restaurant or whatever. And also people who are still advertising don't want their advertisements next to coronavirus news. So when you buy advertising in the digital space or on a page, you can specify as an advertiser what type of stories you don't want that advertising next to. And because of obviously the nature of the coronavirus pandemic, there's a lot of people saying they don't want, a lot of organizations saying they don't want their advertising appearing next to coronavirus news. if you look at, there's been this huge increase in consumption of news, but it's been news about coronavirus. So if you take away that audience, you have, you know, probably a smaller than normal audience to sell to advertisers, essentially. And, you know, it's a story that's affected everybody. The Guardian has had to furlough 100 of its non-editorial staff, that they're, you know, trying to protect the reporting part of the paper to save costs. And it's a story that's repeated across the industry. And the thing that really concerns me is that it's the weakest players who are most vulnerable. That's the local papers, which rely particularly heavily on advertising and struggle to put up paywalls. In the UK, over 50 small and regional publications have suspended print or online operations. It's so bad the government stepped in, moving forward the end of a tax on ebooks and newspapers, promising to focus spending from a large public health campaign on local publications, urging people to buy a paper. Is a similar situation in the US. The Huffington Post published a list of papers. I won't read it out now because I see I'm running out of time, but already dozens that have had to have layoffs, furloughs or pay cuts across the country. And these closures come across on top of, these are sort of an exacerbation of structural issues that have been there for a while. You know, a battered industry that has been hemorrhaging jobs for a long time. A Pew Research Centre report that was published just last month found that over the decade from 2008, half of US journalism jobs have been lost. And just to finish, I'd say that to me, this is particularly worrying. It would be worrying anyway, journalism losing jobs during coronavirus. It's particularly worrying when you see that it's local publications who are being so hard hit, because I think they're sort of the lifeblood of our democracy. They're the people, they're the organisations, the outlets that are doing the scrutiny at the later level. A lot of the stories that we think of today as sort of the major stories of the past, they were often uncovered first by local reporters who went to the courtroom hearing that didn't seem particularly interesting and turned out to cover a scandal, or who spent a long time digging into the local government, you know, misdoings or things like that. And I think that, you know, losing them is not just sad for journalists and communities, but it's a real tragedy for democracy too. So I'll finish there. Sorry, I think I've gone on a bit.
Thank you very much, Emma. We're really pleased to also have your relatives joining us from Cuddington, West Berkshire, Newbury. They're all there in support. So our second guest is Monica Hallan, who's joining us from Delhi. Monica's a 2011 Yale World Fellow, and she's the consulting editor with Mint in India. Monica has public policy experience working with the government of India as an advisor, and she was also a member of the Ministry of Finance Committee on Incentives, and she's been a member on the SEBI Mutual Fund Committee since 2010. So Monica, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you so much. It's a real pleasure to be here. And as I start my opening remarks, I would just want the audience to know that I have always seen myself as a little bit of an outside-in person. So therefore, do take the comments that I make because it's a broad sweep that I'm hoping to cover. It's not, you know, I'm not talking about a particular paper or a particular media house, but it's these are comments across the board. And this is absolutely, it is one of the most important things right now. You know, what is this opportunity and what is the challenge which is being thrown up by COVID-19? Now, I think that it's a catalyst which is bringing the slowly simmering fault lines and the visible cracks across governments, industries, and families out into the open. And I think it's hastened the end of the post-World War equilibrium and institutions which were already fraying. I would look at COVID as an event that has just accelerated this process of change. And before we go into whether this is a win for traditional media, we need to decode what has happened and why. We all worry about fake news, but you know, why have people been so willing to believe fake news? Why is the consumption of the non-traditional media, why has that been so high? Now, traditional media, through the editors and journalists, people like me, have framed news and impacted public perception for hundreds of years. And we have always believed that editors and journalists are fair and unbiased. But possibly the truth is that the news is slanted without intending to, according to our own moral, political, and religious beliefs. And somewhere over the journey, traditional media left out stories that did not fit the liberal frame constructed by the victors of the Second World War. But technology has come and smashed through this construct. And two ways in particular have been devastating for the traditional media. One is that very cheap data plans and a phone and a viewpoint turns everybody into a journalist. And in a way, we can say that news has been democratized. So the news, opinion, and views have broken through the frames which were created by the gatekeepers of these views. For hundreds of years, we have been the gatekeepers. But now that role is suddenly under threat. And what now shows through are many extreme forms of what people have really been thinking. And these views don't tick the boxes of liberalism, secularism, globalization, and democracy. So there's a little bit of shock and awe at what really had been simmering just under the surface. And the proponents of free speech have suddenly found themselves out of arguments on the question of whose free speech. And this bubbling distrust seems to have found a release in the consumption of fake news and the distrust of what is called mainstream media, MSM. This pattern, I think, is true across the world. For traditional mainstream media, it's been a pincer movement. There's a new democratized production and consumption of news, and there's been a fall in revenues because the same technology allows consumption of news on free digital platforms. And this brings me to my second point. Technology has intensified the fault lines in the traditional media of a key conflict of interest. It is the conflict of who are you really serving, the advertiser or the reader viewer. Revenues of traditional media across the world are seeing a sharp fall, and COVID has just proved to be that moment where what was 5 or 10 years away is here now because we are hemorrhaging revenues. Digital subscriptions are up, but revenues are a fraction. And this has reduced the financial viability of traditional media even more, and even more suddenly. It's a ripple effect. It impacts the ability to retain, attract talent. Of course, it's the top heavy and very high Gini coefficient salary structure, which doesn't help. We have to just look at the hemorrhage of the industry to PR and Corpcom to see how we find it so difficult to retain talent. And it is in this context that I would like to see the challenge and the opportunity for traditional media in this COVID-induced moment of change. There is a greater need to introspect as to what our role has been and how we take this moment and then grow from here. And I will just take one more minute to talk about the state of traditional media in India. And I will go back to 2011 when I was at Yale and my husband was on his way to New Haven from New York to be with me. And he struck up a conversation with the cabbie, the taxi driver. And based on my husband's then views, the cabbie identified him as a reader of the NYT and not the WSJ. Now, this was a strange thing for my husband, and he discussed it with me because in India in 2011, we prided ourselves with not having a political slant at all. We could not understand this WSJ versus NYT argument at all. But remember, this was 2011. 2014, we saw a new political alignment where the traditional monopoly of one family and one party was broken by a popular mandate to Narendra Modi in the BJP government. And the media, which prided itself on the lack of political alignment, suddenly found itself at battle with the new media outlets that were completely on the other side of the debate. Earlier, it had been fairly easy to hush these views, but technology again allowed not just views, but the new offerings to push back. And now today, India is having very violent own NYT versus WSJ conversations. There is a new vibrant media in India, but the rest of the world is still staying with parts of the old versions of the story. And there has been the use of one anecdote to paint a country of 1.3 billion. And it's sort of reached it's freeing. This whole concept of using one story and one frame to tell the larger story of such a diverse country is probably over. Because for every anecdote about a poor migrant hurt by the lockdown, there's a story on see how the poor are lining up for alcohol story. For every starving migrant, there's a story about how the poor are actually being given free food, by the local state governments and unwilling to come back. And this is going to increase the cost of labor overall. For every police atrocity story, there's a story about the police bringing cake to a senior citizen who was alone in the lockdown, or dressing up as the god of death, Yama, to push home the message of the lockdown to stay, guys, just stay home. So there is no one story about India. And I think the global media is yet to discover that. And this again brings me back to my original point, that it's our own views and frames of traditional media that has opened the box of distrust and willingness to consume the news, which is so obviously fake. I think COVID-19 is a moment in time for us to reflect, and it is a great moment to win that trust and respect back, and then hope really hard that the revenues come along with that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Monica. Our third guest is Vincent Nee. A 2018 Yale World Fellow, Vincent currently reports for the BBC in London. He's also the co-founder and co-presenter of Asia Matters podcast, which goes beyond the headlines with experts from around the globe to explain what's shaping Asia today. He was previously based in Beijing, Washington, and New York, and reported on events from the Arab Spring in 2011 through to the US presidential elections in 2012 and 2016. As well as the 2014 political protests in Ukraine. Vincent, thanks for joining us.
Fantastic. Thanks so much, Emma. It's great to be back with the World Fellows community and have a chance to catch up with fellow fellows and get to know new friends through this exciting initiative. So thanks so much for organizing this chat. Now, I think certainly since the coronavirus outbreak became a global pandemic in March, we have seen more viewers and readers turning to the likes of the BBC, The Guardian, as well as the New York Times. And on the TV front here in the UK, when the COVID situation started to worsen in March, the BBC's main news channels began to see record high ratings as a result of their coronavirus coverage, while Channel 4 News audience also almost doubled over a very short period of time. And a similar trend also occurred with ITV as well. Now, Emma cited a Reuters report. I also wanted to cite this report as well. That report was published last week on Oxford Reuters website. And according to this report, most major news outlets have had net positive ratings since the start of the COVID outbreak. And among them, TV outlets perform better than newspapers, and outlets such as the BBC, Channel 4, ITV, as well as Sky also get a higher proportion of positive evaluations than many newspapers. I think in part also because they are much more consumed here in the UK than newspapers. Now, meanwhile, according to the same research, all the main TV news outlets have had net positives from their viewers across the political spectrum, which is quite rare here in the UK these days. And the BBC is seen as doing a very good job by a majority, both on the political left, the political right, as well as those in the center. Now, established newspapers have also been doing very well. Emma earlier talked about The Guardian, and in fact, last month, The Guardian and the New York Times unusually overtook their tabloid competitors, i.e. Mail Online and Fox News in web traffic terms. And the Washington Post in the US and the Spanish El País newspaper were also among the best performing websites and established news brands online. And certainly, this is very encouraging to those of us who work in the so-called traditional or legacy news outlets. Now, I think the surge in demand for quality content first reflected the magnitude of this unprecedented health crisis and the audience's appetite for facts in a time of uncertainty. I think it also highlights people's trust, particularly in public broadcasters such as the BBC. People come to us to look for facts and solid analysis rather than sensation. Now, we have also seen a very similar trend in Germany, where their public broadcasters, ARD and ZDF, had ratings which skyrocketed as well. But there are also big questions for many of these outlets. First of all, I think yes, we have seen a surge in ratings and the traffic. Normally we'd see higher ratings mean higher advertising dollars. But in this case, the lockdowns we see around the world mean that many companies have already been driven out of business. And just a few hours ago today, the New York Times revealed its first quarter performance. They reported that the number of new digital subscribers was up by 600,000 in the first 3 months of this year. But at the same time, their advertising revenue fell by 15%. They also forecast in the second quarter, the advertising revenue would continue to fall by as much as 55%. Now, you might argue this might be just a hiccup, but even if the lockdowns are to be lifted very soon, if what lies ahead of us is a severe recession or a depression, consumers will almost certainly reduce their discretionary spending. Now, this would include money spent on media consumption, including news, as well as entertainment. And I think in this case, news is much more likely to be a bigger victim than entertainment. This would have huge implications for newspaper subscriptions as well, I think. Then you might wonder what happens if the economy recovers. After all, we are not expecting COVID-19 to last forever, right? But as we have seen in the aftermath of the financial crisis more than a decade ago, companies will aggressively reevaluate their spending on advertising. This means even though it eventually recovers, it might take a while, if not many, many years. Now, in terms of news outlets, I think public broadcasters such as the BBC are quite fortunate because we're not driven by the same commercial imperatives. But even then, there are questions about the future funding model and cost cuts, et cetera, et cetera. Secondly, even though the current huge demand for media remains during the lockdown, it may be harder and harder to supply fresh material. However, I think this would also depend on when and how media professionals return to work as normal, and that is the biggest question at the moment. Now, if you are interested in this topic, I'd encourage you to visit the BBC's website and read our media editor, Amol Rajan's blog post last month. He talked about this paradox in much detail. And thirdly, and lastly, I think while this crisis did demonstrate to us that in the time of emergency, people would prefer to turn to credible sources for information, which is very good news for established outlets. But it has also exacerbated the earlier trends of digital transformation. In a time of social distancing and the lockdowns, there will be much reduced demand for physical newspapers and magazines, for example. And as I said, this trend had already been happening even before the coronavirus crisis. But this crisis will surely accelerate the digital transformation within the news industry. So all in all, I think it's good to see so many audiences come back to traditional media, but old challenges still remain. And I think it is now more pressing than ever to find a solution.
Vincent, thank you so much. A quick reminder to everybody that we are accumulating questions, so please do feel free to make a suggestion in the chat box and we will put them to our speakers after the final speaker. So up next, we're delighted to have all the way from Uganda. Hopefully, Raymond, you're with us. Is it working? I know we had a slight scare a second ago. Is everything good?
It is. It's
Fantastic.
working now. It's okay.
Brilliant. I had a private message from Raymond saying he might not be able to speak via video, but we're glad that you're here. So up next we have Raymond Mujuni, editor with the Nation Media Group in Uganda. Raymond previously worked in headed investigation desks at NTV and NBS TV. He is a two-time winner of the National Journalism Award and a recipient of the 2018 Young Achievers Award for Media and Journalism. Raymond, thank you so much for joining us. We're looking forward to hearing from you.
All right, thank you so much. I think that I join you with a different perspective. A lot of traditional media in Uganda, particularly broadcast media, has had increased viewership. But when we talk about traditional print, the numbers have gone down. What the lockdown did for traditional print media was that it reduced the number of people who were coming into the city center And that's where majority of the circulation for print papers was happening. So unlike London, where you have addresses where deliveries are made for print papers, in Uganda, deliveries for print papers are made at local supermarkets and people buy them from there. Now, what has happened is that with lockdowns, people are no longer coming into the city center, and that means that the paper has suffered a great deal in circulation, and the numbers are really massive. What we've had to do back home here has been to transform that print paper into an e-paper and then distribute it for free of charge. So for the last 14 days, the major print paper in Uganda, which is a nation media asset, the Daily Monitor, has been distributed for free of charge. For broadcast media, we've had numbers literally skyrocket, probably even 2 times more than what we previously had. And that's been really good in terms of having numbers coming in to watch the news, to watch updates on what's happening on COVID-19. But it's taken away our advertising revenue because majority of the advertisers are using the little monies they have to keep their payrolls intact and also to pay for operation costs. So it's a catch-22 scenario. What we've had to do at the Nation Media Group has been to change the mode within which we tell news. So we're now more focused on community news. We're now more focused on fact-checking the news that's out there in the public. We are also focused on giving people as much public information, as much health information on COVID-19 as is available and possible. Of course, we are in the discussions also about what matters in terms of funding the media. What new ways can we fund the media? And there have been some ideas that have been suggested here and there. Whether they can work is again another crisis altogether. Paywalls can probably work in countries with higher GDP per capita like England, probably like the US. Paywalls can work in countries like Uganda where the GDP per capita for everyone is less than $1,000 in a whole year per annum. So when you talk about paywalls here, that won't work for us. Probably the better way now is to refocus on community news, have the community come in and advertise on very small rates on the information they are consuming. The other focus has been to slowly start to drift away from advertiser revenue and look at how you can market content and then sell that content directly to people who have the money for it. And that, of course, it has catch-22s in terms of editorial policies. It has catch-22s in terms of how much freedom and independence you can have in the content that you put out. And also it has downsides into how much of your staff goes into producing high quality content that you can sell. But one of the other revenue streams that we are seriously considering is a guardian model, which is put out the begging bowl and ask the public to say the journalism that you're consuming is really high quality journalism, which is produced by journalists who deserve equal fair pay, who deserve decent pay so that they can take their children to school, so that they can be able to afford the basic necessities of life. And by putting out that kind of public begging bowl, you could salvage a little of the jobs of journalists that are still left. Our state-owned newspaper, the New Vision, laid off some of the staff members and carried out salary cuts from the top 60%, from the bottom 40%. And that, of course, might spread out all the other newspapers in the country. How longer they can hold out is also another question that we have to ask. But in terms of trust in the media, and we've had some numbers come in. We had a poll that was conducted 2 weeks ago on the number of people who are visiting media streams and where they were getting majority of the information from. And for the first time in 4 years, the traditional media has overtaken social media in terms of access to basic information that people can rely and trust on. And also for the first time in 4 years, we have traditional media celebrity journalists who are the most followed individuals in the country ahead of music celebrities. So there's been a really good turn in terms of trust in the media, and that's really gone up. But in terms of funding for the media, it's a catch-22 for us, and it's something that we have to look into very more seriously.
Raymond, thank you so much, and hopefully Emma is back with us. Brilliant. So I'm going to invite Vincent, Monica, and Emma to join us again. And please do keep the questions coming. That was an incredibly rich portrayal of traditional media and how it's evolved and is evolving in a COVID period from, you know, geographically different contexts, but also I think rightly you have articulated the nuances of how traditional media works from print to broadcast. And one of the first questions, which actually has come up more than once from attendees, is how do you keep the momentum made in perhaps reaching a bigger audience, maybe a more captive audience who are at home, whether it's broadcast media or whether it's more traditional media. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on how you keep the gains made during COVID, if there are active plans in that. So maybe Raymond, we can start with you, having just heard from you.
Yeah, so one of the things that we did immediately the COVID-19 pandemic broke out, it started, of course, away from here. So by the time we got here, we were a little bit more prepared. So the day that the nation instituted a lockdown, what we did was transform the print media into e-paper and give that out for free so that people could access it from their homes using the internet for free. What's that done is that it's allowed people who previously didn't access traditional media platforms, who didn't buy the newspaper, to actually take their chances and see how good or how better we are than all the other forms that are giving out information. And say the online media that's just sprouting in the country. And it sort of portrayed, first of all, the depth that we're willing and able to go to. It also portrayed the quality of the journalism that we have. So unlike online media, most of online media in Uganda is based in Kampala. Just as Kampala is the capital city.
Raymond, thank you.
Most of the online media is based within Nairobi, but the traditional media has a across the country, across countries, and that's also helped us because
Raymond, apologies to cut you off. I think the bandwidth is causing you to not come across clearly. So maybe we can come back to you in the next line of questions. You can finish that process. I don't think Raymond can hear very well. So maybe if I go to Monica next, just on the question of how do you keep the momentum going?
You know, I actually worry the momentum is here and COVID is not going anywhere for the next 2 years. My own analytics is that this is not something which goes away very fast. So the problem of the media is financial. We are hemorrhaging revenue. And yes, the small media is going to be far more vulnerable like any other small business than the larger media. But as I said, whatever fault lines on the revenues and viability was there earlier is manifest today because you're hemorrhaging every month. Every newspaper has either laid off plus put in place salary cuts. And we will have to work out some ways of solving this problem. And I don't think anybody in the world has solved this problem. New York Times, again, massive increase in digital subscriptions, but fraction of revenues. So I have a couple of ideas. One is that, look, either we start treating news as a public utility, where the local governments, where the local councils pay for the small local newspapers, because the advertisers are not coming back. We have to understand that it's not happening and people are unwilling to pay. They're not going to be paying for content which is free. The second, again, you have to think out of this box. Do we have an OPEC kind of an agreement between the large newspapers of the world to set a baseline for cover price? Because what has happened also in India is that the newspaper is almost given away free. It's the advertiser who's paying. So do we then have a giant coalition where we all agree that no, there is a certain amount of money which has to be paid by the reader? Now, again, it's an OPEC kind of collaboration. We don't know, whether it's possible or not. Second is that you have to start getting the reader to pay for the content. So a smaller print edition, which pays for the basic cost, and then a large digital push. But again, this model has flaws because the smaller guys cannot do that big digital push. The last, which is going to be very controversial, is to say cross-subsidize pure news, put firewalls around the journalists who do the real journalism work, And the rest of the brand of the paper is used for either events, conferences, products, other stuff which generates revenue. Because, you know, news is really what somebody wants hidden, and you are not going to get advertisers who are coming in to pay for it. So we will have to work out new models if we want, and we do want this media to survive. It is essential for democracy.
Monica,
So,
thank you.
yeah. Okay.
Thank you so much. So, Raymond is back with us, so hopefully he will be able to join us back shortly. But maybe if I go over to Vincent, just in terms of your thoughts on maybe what Monica has said, and then broadly, how do you keep the gains made? Oh, you're on mute, Vincent.
Right.
There we go.
Right, thanks. Well, I think, you know, Monica floated around some really interesting thoughts. On the last one, I think this is already happening with the economists, right? So you know, for many, many years, the economists keeps churning out really high quality of journalism and insightful analyses. At the same time, they have this business of organizing conferences and, you know, economist intelligence unit. But I guess, you know, the question is, when everybody enters this market, what the competition would look like, right? And I think, you know, from the content producers perspective, I think, you know, this is a, you know, momentous time for all producers. I think, you know, there are two things that I think we ought to be doing. You know, one is the innovation of storytelling. I mean, for a long time, established media in the UK, certainly it's the case that, you know, we are capturing quite advanced sort of, you know, citizens and very content consumers are very much male dominated, you know, age group is slightly higher. So this is a very good opportunity for us to find a way also to capture as well as retain younger and female audience. This is one thing. And the other thing is, you know, this is an opportunity for all outlets to compete with each other in terms of, I talked about the storytelling, but also innovation in your business model. There are a few examples, but I think, you know, one of the ideas Monica also talked about is to subsidize media. I think this is actually going to be very, very controversial. There are some governments stepping into this market to save outlets. But, you know, once this conversation starts to be debated around the world, you know, we wouldn't be able to get you know, reach this same conclusion. So I think, you know, there's a lot of food for thought there, you know, in terms of innovation, in terms of competition, and in terms of business model. And I think it also depends on different countries in different contexts.
Vincent, thank you. Emma, if I can come to you and ask you a question. So something Monica raised there, which is a constant theme that we've heard throughout so far, which is to keep the gains. Whilst viewership is increasing, revenues are going down because obviously people can't move and money isn't flowing as well. How do you reconcile democratization of information with things like social media, where people have access to what they think is journalism, and the potential of keeping momentum by putting up paywalls and asking readers to pay, when actually consumers are thinking these things should be free because we're getting access to a lot of it now?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's definitely a big issue, and people have got very used to getting news for free because there was the whole era of, you know, everybody getting online and most things were available, and you often see complaints. You'll see people getting on. I mean, recently there was a piece in one of our competitor papers that sort of caused a big stir, and a lot of people were just screenshotting the whole thing and sharing it on Twitter because they're behind a paywall. And, you know, there were a lot of journalists, even people who work for rival publications, sort of saying, you know, journalists need to be paid like everyone else. And I think, you know, one of the problems that journalism hasn't been able to really wrestle with in terms of the business model and how it works is that for young people, you know, in the same way you don't buy an album, you stream a song. People don't, or there are people who have loyalty to particular outlets, but many people don't want to just pay for the Wall Street Journal or the New York Times or the Washington Post, because what they want to do is be able to get a sort of a bit from each of them. And no one sort of worked out, there have been attempts, but they haven't been very successful, of how you might do something like a sort of Spotify for journalism that would share revenue. But when you're talking about making it sustainable, I mean, I do think there's also, I think everything everyone said about advertising and those models is true, but I also think there's a bit of an elephant in the room sort of related to social media, which is Facebook and Google themselves. Part of the reason that media advertising revenues are in such a mess at the moment is that the big social media giants take something like, and my colleagues can correct me here if I'm wrong, but in the UK I think it's 90% of the revenue. So if you click through to a Guardian story from Facebook that's been posted on Facebook, the ads that you see on the Guardian site, 90% of that money will go to Facebook, not to the Guardian. Wow. And that has been, if you looked at what was happening with advertising revenues for a lot of digital or news organizations that were trying to become digital, they were slowly increasing. I mean, there was questions about viability and all of that, but this came in quite quickly that Facebook and Google moved to, I would call it, abuse their monopoly power to essentially hoover up the advertising money, and advertising dropped back off a cliff again from digital revenues. And I think, you know, there's obviously been a lot of talk, this is sort of beyond the media industry per se, but there's been a lot of talk about whether those companies are monopolies, whether they should be broken up, if so, how. I think even Facebook, you know, even these companies, they rely on content creation. They themselves realize that they are cannibalizing the industry that they need. In the UK, they've put, I've got the details here, £4.5 million into a fund for local journalism to support 80 community journalists working at local news publications. Now, they may not be the ones that are necessarily the worst hit by Facebook. I don't know who is sharing or whatever, but I think it's interesting, you know, obviously they are presenting it as a positive thing, but to me it's a recognition of the damage that those particular structural things have done. And I do think if that structural issue on how advertising revenue is distributed was addressed, it could help things a little bit. And just very quickly, the other thing I think on revenue that is a small thing, but if you go onto a lot of websites now, they won't make you pay, but they want you to register, because, you know, in this world where sort of data is money, the more you know about your readers, the easier it is to make money off them. You know, if you can say, I know my reader is a, you know, professional managerial class who, you know, likes whatever, I don't know, golf or something, you can get a well-off golf advertiser to put an ad, you know, sell an ad to them. Or, I mean, you can tell I'm not on the business side of the paper, but so I think there's a big push by a lot of organizations to try and get more loyal readers and to get more information about those readers rather than chasing clickbait. And I actually think that's potentially a really positive thing for the at least for the sort of serious news industry, because you don't have that race for pure viewer numbers.
Emma, thank you. And I think it resonates well with the comment that we had in terms of talking about Facebook and talking about platforms which people go through. And one of the comments was, since the massive amount of misinformation comes to us for free with no cost, but consumers need to pay for traditional media, misinformation seems to be winning the battle. And I think that's kind of coaxing through all of this. And I know we've talked about business models and ads. I'd love to get back to the core roots of journalism here and COVID. And in terms of your own personal context and the work that you've done, how have you tried to cover COVID when so much of it is an unknown? And a good example of that is Emma will know, herd immunity in the UK. It's something which, you know, we follow the science. And so I'd love to get a sense from you, because it's clear that traditional media has regained trust at a time when people are captive audiences and they are looking for more reputable sources. How have you ensured the fine balance of articulating factual information that's scientific without necessarily, you know, going for a more, maybe a scaremongering tactic of whatever it might be to try and get people to follow? So Raymond, just to test if you're back, can I go to you with that question?
Yes, I'm back. So first of all, I had some thoughts about the previous question. I don't know if I could just jump in for a minute on that and then move on.
Please.
So I think that the biggest thing that we've suffered is the perception problem of journalism. There's a lot of public information out there that people perceive journalism to also be that kind of public information. So when people log onto their social media sites, for example, and see political analysts putting out a long reads, they think that that's journalism, and it's only right and fair that they think that because we haven't been able to define what journalism is and separate that from all the other types of public information and then create value that people have to pay for. And we've seen it a lot in Uganda, because in the last weeks when we've been distributing a digital paper free of charge to everyone, many people have actually been asking us, wait a minute, I didn't know that you guys have this much access to public information. and you analyze it in a way that's easy for me to understand, and you help me make decisions on my day-to-day life. So would analyze information even on lockdown, say, what does the lockdown mean? Who can go out, who can't go out? Who's an essential worker? How long does the curfew last? What time does it start? What time does it end? So putting that information in a way that journalism would demand would separate it from all the other types of public information. And I think that for me is more important, that before we do anything, let's define this thing called journalism and define it in a way that separates it from all the other types of public information. Then we create value from it. And that maybe might be the lifeline in the short run.
Thank you. Emma, may I go to you with that question on
reporting COVID?
Yeah.
And I mean, I think there's been a debate going on in newsrooms about where that line is. You know, what is scaremongering and what is, particularly in the early days of this. You know, perhaps because I'd been involved in covering SARS. I wasn't in China at the time, but I was following it. And when I worked in China, I followed some of the sort of fallout from it. You know, I was very concerned about it. You know, I would say, you know, I sort of was following it very closely at a time when it was still sort of a local concern in China. And, you know, then it became a big issue in Britain. And I think some people felt that what was scaremongering for someone else would be alerting the public to a massive danger. And I think part of the challenge for journalists have been trying to work out where that line lies, because, you know, we have over 30,000 people dead in the UK now. And, you know, if you look at countries like Taiwan and how they've handled it, you could argue that the large majority of those lives could potentially have been saved. So I think there is a sort of debate to be had even inside very serious newsrooms when you're facing a sort of calamity of this scale. How do you decide what is the right amount to enable people to say, okay, I realized this was a serious threat and I could respond as I chose, without tipping into fear-mongering or alarmism. And for me personally, it's completely changed my working life, because I had possibly something that needs to change as well. But, you know, I traveled. That was my job. I was a foreign correspondent. I was based in the UK, and I don't know when I'm going to be able to start doing that again. So I'm now sort of helping my colleagues reporting stuff on the UK, working with, you know, people I already knew, colleagues on the ground. So for me, it's totally changed everything about what I do.
Thank you, Emma. And Monica, can I ask the same question, and maybe with a view to understanding the balance of your thinking of reporting versus how do we make sure we capture and keep a captive audience? Is that in the back of your mind? So content versus audience in terms of the reporting of COVID. Oh, you're on mute.
Okay. The mainstream media has done actually extremely well, I think, like the rest of the world has, in terms of doing that fine balance between reporting as it is and not fear-mongering. I think that bread and butter work has happened very well. I feel that there is a deeper level at which some of us have been trying to work to also take away some of the very sort of extreme in messaging which comes on social media, on WhatsApp groups, where, you know, you try and frame the question in terms of saying that on one side, the potential of, in India, it was between 1 to 2 million deaths versus the lockdown. So, you know, you try and frame questions through columns, through doing videos to say that, you know, these are really the choices in front of any government. And possibly the fact that we want to save lives, even though the economy is in shambles, is a choice which is so difficult to make. Or even put this question of an immunity pass. I think a lot of countries are talking about a health pass of people with the immunity. I mean, the fact that testing is not happening right now is different. But, you know, how do you even think through a world where some people can go to work because they are the immunes and some people can't? So just taking it to a slightly deeper level than just the basic bread butter, and then trying to trigger thoughts and debates as to, you know, what are the choices in front of us, and then how do we take those decisions? So that's that's been sort of my role, to try and take the thoughts a little deeper in terms of these moral questions of, are we doing the right thing or are we not doing the right thing?
Thank you, Monica. Vincent?
Well, I think Monica raised a really important point, which is you don't know whether you are doing the right thing until you know you are doing the right thing, and vice versa. You don't know you are doing the wrong thing until you are told you are doing the wrong thing. I think, my experience of reporting this health crisis is that it's the first time in my career that I discovered there's so much resource out there in terms of medical expertise. There are so many good, medics, researchers can explain in very sort of, easy to understand the language to the audience about the nature of this COVID crisis. I think, now we all understand, this crisis is unprecedented. It's actually quite scary. We don't know when this is going to end. And I think in terms of reporting, talking about finding a balance, we do report how severe this crisis is and the damage it has done to the world economy, but also, in terms of content producing, we also need to look forward to see how countries are lifting their lockdowns and what kind of lessons, etc., we're going to learn. And I think that's the part of the public service broadcasting, which is to educate and to inform, to provide information and debate with the arguments from all sides.
Vincent, thank you so much. I'm conscious of time, and we do finish exactly an hour. So we have about 5 minutes. I'd love to give you each a minute each, and maybe leave on something hopeful, something practical as a community of practical good society builders. Could you maybe mention something that you have seen in terms of an innovation that has given you hope for traditional media in terms of its resurgence post-COVID? It could be something small, it could be something big, something that you have seen in your day-to-day work. And I'm going to pick on someone to go first. It's always harder, but maybe I can go to Emma first, just because you're in London.
Well, I'd say I went to a testing centre to talk to people who were waiting to be tested, and quite often in the UK, or in any country actually, when you approach people, there's a certain suspicion of journalists. People are quite wary, and everybody seemed really open to, obviously I was asking questions in a respectful way and said, if you don't want to talk, please, there's no pressure. But people who were lining up to be tested really seemed keen to talk. They seemed to really, what we journalists idealise our job as doing, which is helping the public get the information that they need to know. It felt like members of the general public, who often have quite a low impression of us for many very good reasons, that was kind of aligned, our ideal of what we wanted to do and how we were being perceived, and that was very nice.
Fantastic, thank you. Raymond?
So for me, the most hopeful thing has been, so one of our biggest restaurants here, it's called Cafe Java's. So they decided, together with their meal, the breakfast meal that they were delivering to people's homes who ordered for it, they'd be delivering for them a paper from all of the newspapers, and sort of give that out. They'd buy the paper from us and deliver it to individuals in their homes. And first of all, it increases our revenue, no doubt. But also secondly, people receiving their breakfast with their news is something that's really good. And I hope that it can drive a culture change so that people start to take their breakfast here with the news. And that way they could save all of us, they could save our jobs.
Fantastic, thank you so much. Monica, if I may go to you.
We actually have a great moment where a lot of the past can go away. For instance, in India, there's a whole re-rating of what the government can do, both state and center, and the police. And media is no different. I mean, the entire mainstream media has been under attack over a lot of issues in the past 10 years. But the way that COVID has got reported and the way that perception has changed about what we are doing, I think there is a moment in time where we can seize this, and again, through introspection of what we are doing, take this forward. So this is really my hopeful story, that there is a moment in which we are all forced to think about what is happening.
Fantastic, thank you so much. And Vincent?
Well, what I'm very delighted to discover throughout this pandemic and previous a few months of experience of reporting is that there is a sort of increased appreciation of longer form and more insightful, beyond headlines kind of analysis among the audience. And I think this is a really good thing. If we're talking about the ultimate goal of the media is to educate, to inform the public and helping them make sense of the world, I think this is really good direction forward. So this is what, you know, delights me, because I've got this podcast called Asia Matters, which tries to achieve the same goal, but also it's something that gives me a lot of hope.
Brilliant. Monica, Emma, Raymond, Vincent, thank you so much. That was a most, I mean, we went right across the globe and had some brilliant innovations around traditional media. We're very, very, very grateful. And for those of you listening, please do, the video will go up on a new YouTube page, which we will promote across our social media channels. So all the more reason for you to follow us. And please do tweet your experiences and tag us at Good Sock Forum. Emma.
Well, thank you all for joining us. And I hope you'll be able to join us again on Sunday at the same time. And we're going to be discussing health on the front lines in Africa and the Philippines, and asking, why are they not seeing the same death rates as Europe and the US?